This afternoon, what I want to do is talk to you about the Kirkin of the Tartan, which is purely a Scottish-American event. If you go to Scotland, don't ask the minister about the Kirkin of the Tartan, because they're going to look at you with a blank face. The second thing is, how many of you have been to a Kirkin? Oh, well. What I'd like to do first is just to refresh. There are three parts to the typical classic Kirkin. The societies march in together, they sit together. That started in 1941 with the first Kirkin. They assembled outside the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, and they came in as a group, sat as a group. The second part, and this is, by the way, all at Christ Church, St. Michael's, is the blessing of the Tartan. That did not occur until 1951. The church, it occurred at the Church of Pilgrims, which is a Presbyterian church in Washington. That was the first year somebody actually took the tartan up, put it on a communion table, and the minister blessed it. It is typical to have the pipers play some kind of a lament. And Flowers of the Forest seems to be the most common one, shall we say. Now, we started this project, we being the St. Andrew's Society of Washington, to document the history of the Kirkin. If you go on the web, I can guarantee you there's a lot of mythology out there, as I call it. And we wanted one story, very accurate, that laid out the whole, what is the history of the Kirkin. In order to do that, and this is somewhat an eye test, but in order to do that, we did have to reach out to a large number of archives, to the various churches that have been involved in the Kirkin. And once again, I'm talking now mainly about the Washington Kirkin. And then places like the Baltimore St. Andrews and other oral histories we were able to get. Now, this is kind of a roadmap, so we don't get lost this afternoon. And we'll talk first about the 1941 beginnings, the first Kirkin, and then go to the naming of the Kirkin in 43, make a short stop at Peter Marshall's heart attack in 46, and then go into the 50s, which really solidified the Kirkin of the Tartan as this Scottish-American tradition. And finally, we'll come back to Talbot County. So, the first thing is, I got to get your mentality back to 1939, 1940. These were not good days. The UK basically was standing by itself against the Nazis. The society in Washington had, and you'll meet several of them as we go through, a large number of immigrants, Scots who had immigrated into the United States in the 20th century. And they also had a significant number of first generations. Well, these people had connections back. They were not, a historic descendant. They had family back in Scotland. They had friends back in Scotland. And so there was a great motivation. Hey, we got to do something. We got to help. they built a great relationship with the British Embassy because the embassy had built up a fairly substantial military staff. The embassy supported all of the fundraising. They provided all films. They allowed them to use the gardens on the embassy grounds for garden parties in the summertime, anything to help raising the funds. And fundraising really became a big priority. Now, up until the U.S. got into the war, there were these neutrality laws. So you had to do a lot of reporting, and that's where these numbers come from. And you can see that across the U.S., all of the allied ethnic groups, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just as an example, yeah, in 1940 dollars, it was about 30 million. If you translate that to 2024, that's about almost 6.5 million, or 647 million, I'll get that straight. So there was a lot of money, and it took organization and work to do it. These are the kinds of groups that benefited from that. Initially, all the money that came into St. Andrews went to the British war relief charities, but as the United States got into it, the monies went to various U.S. war relief charities. Now, who did this? Because it takes leadership, it takes, as I said, people. Well, this gentleman, Murdo Graham Finlayson, he's a real entrepreneur. He immigrated to the United States in 1906. By 1930, he was married with 2 children, owned his own house, owned a building construction company in the Chicago area with his brother. He's the kind of guy that you could give a task to and say, go do this. And he was able to pick the right people, and he was able to sell things. So, and he really became the partner with Dr. Marshall, the Reverend Dr. Marshall, in setting up the Kirkin. And as it says there, he was the president of St. Andrews for several years. Now, he built a team. Bill Young, interesting guy, born in Salem, Massachusetts, of Scottish parents though, and they all went back to Scotland. And he immigrated to the U.S., an attorney, and he ran the committee because just like today where we had to set up a separate foundation, well, under the Neutrality Act laws, you had to have a separate organization. And Bill was the chair. These people, and if you can see some of this, I'll move over here. These are all photographs out of the Evening Star, which was one of the big Washington papers of its day. And here you have the famous, as I call them, mobile kitchens. Mobile kitchens were really needed in the UK because of 2 things. Number one, the bombs were destroying buildings, houses, etc. People had to be fed. And secondly, into the UK were coming a lot of refugees, but military refugees, armies from these various countries. Norway, Poland, in the case of Scotland, there was a large contingency of Polish army in Scotland throughout the war. And it was a training ground. So A simple thing like that, both the Baltimore Society as well as the Washington Society were out, raising money for it. Bill James, a fellow from Glasgow, was in the selling business of meat at the wholesale level, and he ran all of the sales for the fundraising. Buell, he in turn, a great administrator, and he kept everything straight with IRS and whatever else had to be done to get through the bureaucracy. Here's the real hero, though. And I'm not going to go through a big, long biography of Peter Marshall. After he died in 1949, his wife wrote the book, A Man Called Peter, which was made into a film in 1955. But the summary is that here is a Scot who a relative of his, a cousin, convinced him that if he really wanted to be a minister, he needed to come to America. Because of the caste system, he was in an apprentice program, doing very well, but he was never going to become a minister in Scotland. He came here, went to Columbia Seminary, which is where Reverend Johnson graduated from, in Georgia. Ultimately was called to Washington, to New York Avenue Presbyterian, and was the chaplain of the U.S. Senate, and that's kind of the summary. But he was also the president of St. Andrews for a number of years, 44 to 48, and he designed and fathered the Kirkin of the Tartan. What led up to it, and I think the most important thing is, by March of 41, things weren't looking very good. And if you can imagine, there needed to be some kind of spiritual uplifting, some kind of solace for the society members who were certainly worried about concerned about their relatives and friends in Scotland. So the discussion started with the president, Finlayson, and Dr. Marshall on what are we going to do? What can we do? Can we have a church service? And it turned into the Kirkin of the Tartan. Now, in the beginning, the very first one, it was an evening, 8 p.m., standard order of worship, Presbyterian evening service, period. Yes, St. Andrews marched in, sat as a group, but the basic order of worship was not changed. There was no blessings. We'll talk briefly about the sermon. So all Peter Marshall had really done was to say, I'm going to take the evening service and I'm going to make it a special service for the St. Andrews people, along with the larger Scottish American community in Washington. Lest we forget, a couple of points. The thing that strikes me every time I read this sermon is the amount of time he spent saying to the assembled crowd that you are not being disloyal to the U.S. if you have emotional and feelings towards the land of your birth. And he made that distinction time and time again. And my sense is that underlying some of the struggles that he was having within his own church community was that issue. New York Avenue Presbyterian had the kind of reputation of being pretty progressive, quote unquote, and probably was in the mode of saying, we want to be absolutely neutral. We do not want to get into this war. So Marshall starts the sermon off that way, and then, as you can see, talked extensively about prayers, but it really, at the bottom line there, is the most important, and that is that reminding our hearts that the power of God is stronger than the power of Hitler. That sermon kind of set the tone for all of the wartime sermons. Okay, we move along to the naming of the Kirkin. Now, I'm cautioned by the retired Presbyterian minister who is editing for me, for us, because Dick says, you know what, this naming thing could be as simple as one day Peter Marshall goes into the office and his secretary says, would you please name this service? They don't know what to call it. And that was true. In looking through the memos, it's called the special service, the parade service, the evening service, the spring service. And then some of them put those words together and call it, a combination. The other thing is, Marshall loved Scotland. He never lost that tie, that emotional tie. And it comes through in a number of his different sermons. So you're looking at an individual who has a tremendous background from Scotland. You know what? I got to name the service. Kirkin has been in the Scottish lexicon for centuries. It's not an unusual term. It refers to someone coming to church and a blessing. So if you take the other part of it, what are the symbols of Scotland? And Tom Devine has a whole chapter on highlandism, which is that the symbols of the Scottish nation came from the poorest and most rural area, and those symbols being the bagpipe, the tartan, and the kilt. So if you're looking for a quick name, and if you're a Scot like Marshall, Kirkin of the Tartan falls right in place. Not too hard to imagine him doing that, despite all of the mythology that's out there. Okay, the heart attack. Peter Marshall, March of 1946, is in the pulpit. It's at the first service. He had 2 morning services. He was a very popular guy, and lots of people wanted to come to New York Avenue Presbyterian to hear him. And he literally had the heart attack in the pulpit. He was taken to George Washington University Hospital, and fundamentally it took him a long time before he came back. It was October of that year before he was back in the pews. This gentleman, Charles Stewart Mackenzie, was a friend of Marshall's, a member of St. Andrews. He was the pastor, senior minister at Western Presbyterian Church, which in geographic terms it was often said the Presbyterians cornered the White House, with New York Avenue Presbyterian on the east and Western Presbyterian on the west, where it's, right now their old church was right where the World Bank is today. Very first generation American. And the thing about it is that he did not waste any time. He stepped in that Wednesday, the 3rd of April. He had a meeting with his session, which is the governing body of a Presbyterian church. And they approved about 5 or 6 new members. And then he basically announced, he said, on the April the 28th, at the evening service, the St. Andrew Society will be here. In the session records, it never mentioned Kirkin. It just said the society will be here. Okay, moving on. In 1949, when Peter Marshall did pass away in January, there was no Kirkin. It just wasn't. I think there was too much shock. Marshall was only 47 years old. Well, and coronary care in those days was not what it is today. So people just didn't know what to do, and I think that's the simplest answer. In May of that year, the New York Avenue Presbyterian had a memorial service for the 4 pastors who were pastors during a war. 1812, War 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II. 2 of them, Marshall and Laurie, were Scots. The society was invited and attended, and frankly, when we look at the service bulletin, and we have that service bulletin, it's very much like a Kirkin. The society came in, it sat together, they played, the pipers played Flowers of the Forest, so forth. So you could call it like, okay, it filled in, but technically there was no Kirkin in 49. Here's another interesting guy that is important in the 1950s. Born in Japan of American missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries, educated in the United States, ordained in the Presbyterian Church in 1921, went back to Japan, and left Japan in 1941 before the war broke out, and joined OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and had a career in that business and followed by State Department. Meanwhile, he's kind of a traveling guest preacher. And when you look through the Evening Star, you often saw his name showing up at various Presbyterian churches out in the Washington area. So he's well known, and a member of the St. Andrew Society, became the chaplain in 46 and stayed there until 1958. Tom Henderson is what I call the blessing, because Henderson wrote the Henderson letters, which are clear explanations of how the Kirkin progressed in the 1950s. And we'll talk more about that. He ended up staying, his last assignment in World War II was in Washington. He ended up staying. He had already married an American back in the 30s. He was in the garment business, and so he came back and forth between Scotland and the U.S. in the 1930s. He had an American wife. He obviously liked Washington, stayed here, and ultimately became president of the society. The 1950 Kirkin has two things that are important. Number one is it happened. Because had it not happened, the Kirkin, the tradition may have gone away. Simple. It just would have disappeared. They were having trouble, they being the society, of finding a home for the Kirkin. Once again, Mackenzie stepped forward and said, we'll do it at Western Presbyterian. He managed to get his session to go along with that for at least 1 year. So that's the first thing. The second thing is our friend Tom Henderson. Babs and Tom invite another couple, unnamed, to join them at this Kirkin. And near the end of the Kirkin, the husband says to Tom, kind of whispers, when are they going to bless the Tartan? Well, he didn't have an answer. They had never done that before. Never happened. So time goes on, and around about 7 weeks, 8 weeks before the 51 Kirkin, which Daniel Buchanan had, set up at the Church of the Pilgrims, he gets a phone call from Henderson saying, Henderson tells him this whole story about, my friend, and they wanted to know when they were going to bless the Tartan. But when you read the letter, it's very carefully laid out. My sense is, because Buchanan said to him, fine, write all this down, send it to me, and we'll figure it out. And that's what Henderson did. And so the first thing about the 51 Kirkin is that was the first time, and Reverend Buchanan carried the tartan up to the communion table, and it was blessed. And that's the first time that happened. The second thing that's going on is Reverend Mackenzie. These guys all work together. It's an amazing little group of clergymen. And Mackenzie and Luther Miller are next door, not next door, backyard neighbors. One lives on Jocelyn, the other one on Jennifer, and their backyard. He invites the now canon of the cathedral to go to this service. So after the service, at some point, Canon Miller comes charging into the Mackenzie's house, and this is according to then 7-year-old David Mackenzie, who we all know and love, said that Miller was a very forceful guy. There was nothing easy about it. He was forceful. And he just basically came in and said, we have got to move the Kirkin to the cathedral, period. End of conversation. Or in so many words. Now, okay, remember, they're still kind of struggling around, they being St. Andrews, where is a home for the Kirkin? It's, they haven't found a church yet that's going to host this. Now they have somebody saying, okay, let's move it to the cathedral. It turns out that the dean of the cathedral at the time, a grandson of Woodrow Wilson. He was the longest, I'm pretty sure, the longest serving dean of the Washington Cathedral. He was there, obviously, a long time. He fell in love with the Kirkin. He worked very well with Buchanan, and the two of them figured out, how do you take this Presbyterian service ceremony and fit it into an 11 o'clock Eucharist Episcopalian service? And they did. I call them the love letters. After this Kirkin, the society secretary, Gilchrist, wrote this magnificent letter to the dean, to Francis Sear, just saying, this has been great, this has been the best Kirkin we ever had, we've had more people, this is wonderful. In turn, Dean Sear comes back with just the same. And the bottom line, you know, that the cathedral really liked it, it was wonderful, boy. And it said, in effect, it was an invitation to bring the Kirkin to the cathedral at any point the society wanted to. And that started a relationship way back in 52 between the society and the cathedral. 53, Dwight Eisenhower is the president. Through some friendships, and I know somebody and he knows somebody, Eisenhower goes to the National Presbyterian Church. Earlier in 53, he had been baptized by that minister privately, because he grew up in Kansas, Eisenhower did, and at a church which did not do adult baptisms. And so he was never baptized. But that was taken care of. And they also laid a wreath at the statue of John Witherspoon, who was a Scot, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and president of Princeton. So the 53. There is, now Buchanan comes back into the play, and the good Reverend Buchanan, chaplain of St. Andrews, comes to a Board of Managers meeting, all ready for the 1954 Kirkin at a church, another Presbyterian church, so forth. There was a real debate. And you can see this in the minutes of that meeting. And the board turned him down and said, no, we are accepting Dean Sear's invitation to go back to the cathedral. And so in 54, they went back to the cathedral. And it really, as I said earlier, it formed a relationship. The Virginia Highland Games used to be at the Episcopal High School in Alexandria. And the reason it started there was Dean Sear. He worked that so that Highland Game started. There is an architectural boss of the crest of the St. Andrews, Washington, up in the cathedral. And so it's been a long-term relationship. And in 93 or at 83, it was moved to the evensong in the afternoon for a number of different reasons. Okay, that's kind of the summary of where we got to. Now, and we do have a representative of Baltimore here with us, Bill. they were really the first, or the society, to have their own Kirkin.
To adopt it.
And they did so in 1957 at the Emmanuel Episcopal Church in Baltimore. And one of their members took it to St. Anne's in Annapolis, where it's still, both of these Kirkins still continue. And in good old Talbot County, the St. Andrew Society here was formed in 1971. The first Kirkin was September the 17th, 1972. And it was part of the St. Michael's Day celebration, which was a Saturday, Sunday celebration. I did not, to be very honest, we didn't spend any time on the spread of the Kirkin. Our focus was 41 to 54. But my intuition, if I could, and probably can prove at some point, is that Reverend Buchanan, who was so instrumental from about, well, the late 40s into 1958, was the one who really worked very hard to get that Kirkin over here. Now, it turned out in 1958, Buchanan retired from all of his jobs in Washington and moved to Easton. He is one of the founding members of the society. And there were a lot of Presbyterians, and the pastor of that church was also one of the founding members. How it got where it got, I don't know. But we today have not only that, but we also have the Kirkin in Oxford. And you know, when Reverend Cross arrived, you know, he recognized the deep roots that Oxford had, the deep Scottish roots that Oxford had, and the families that still had, there were some survivors of those families living in Oxford. And so he started a Kirkin, and which continues to this day. So now you can take everything I said and put it on one slide.
Why didn't you start with that?
Now I tell you. So I will be happy to answer questions.
George?
Yes. Go ahead.
Father Etherton started at St. Michael's.
Atherton?
Father Etherton?
Yes.
And I was there.
And you were there.
Yes, I was.
Now, at the first Kirkin. And you're correct. Etherton, I didn't mention that, but Etherton was one of the founding members, and absolutely.
Yeah, terrific guy.
Went to your left there.
Why were the Presbyterians anxious, almost it sounds, to turn it over to the Episcopal Church? What were the tensions there with this?
I think what it really was is members of the board of St. Andrews understood the long-term value of the cathedral. Remember, this is 1951. The cathedral wasn't even finished. But it was already getting that reputation as the national cathedral. And so to have the Kirkin there, they believed was a step up. Now, the other thing is, the facility is fantastic. I I mean, if you want to bring a pipe band someplace, it's a church. I mean, that place, you know, it's, and so those things fell into place. I haven't sensed that there was a lot of the arguments over Presbyterianism versus Episcopalianism. I think it was really, they wanted to find a home because, and it's a lesson that Scottish Americans have to understand. When Marshall dies, like any Presbyterian church, New York Avenue starts a process of calling another minister. And a year later, they call George Docherty, a Scot. They brought him over from Scotland. You would think that he would embrace this and just continue. His vision of his ministry didn't include the Kirkin. Now, he wasn't opposed to it. He wasn't opposed to St. Andrew's. He was a member. And as a matter of fact, he preached at one of the Kirkins at the cathedral in the 70s. And he was a leader, especially in civil rights, and also he's credited with convincing Eisenhower to put "In God We Trust" on money. But yes, sir.
Just a quick point about its association with the Episcopal Church. After the Revolutionary War, it wasn't so popular to swear allegiance to the king, which was part of the Anglican faith. And so the Episcopal Church evolved out of that. Samuel Seabury, who was to become the first American bishop of the Episcopal Church, went to England to be consecrated. You need 3 bishops to consecrate you. And they said, sure, we'll do it, but you must swear allegiance to the king. Sam got back on his boat and went up to Scotland, and they said, we will consecrate you, but you need to base your Eucharistic rite on the Scottish rite. Sam said, done. So that's another tie-in with this whole thing. And as far as me personally, I was raised by a Scottish nanny from Clydebank. She lived with my family longer than I did. I think Scots are great.
We'll send you the application tomorrow.
Yes, sir.
George, one of my favorite memories as a kid, I went to Washington to visit my uncle, and I read in the paper that Ike and Mamie were going to church at the Presbyterian church you spoke of. And I went over, maybe I was 12 years old, maybe I was 10, I don't know, and stood at the bottom of the steps, and Ike and Mamie came out, and I was as close to him as to you, and said, hi, Ike. And now you bring it all home to me. I was at the place where it all happened.
That's great.
Good.
And with the man.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
I will say,
Well done.